Okay. Okay, wonderful. All right. Thank you all for coming. Those of you in person, of course, but those of you on Zoom as well, to this event with Dr. Daniel Martinez HoSang. It was organized by the UW-Bothell Labor Studies Colloquium with support from the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. This is our second event of spring quarter. We have a series of exciting events coming up in the next few weeks. That includes Andrea Jones and Heather Berg speaking on digital sex work, labor justice, and capitalism on May 3rd. Misha Cardenas and Percy Lazard speaking on imagining trans, non-binary, and two-spirit futures on May 10th, and Kim Kelly speaking about her new book, Fight Like Hell, The Untold History of American Labor on May 17th. Details of those events will be in the chat and are also available on the UW Labor Studies website. It's my pleasure to welcome Daniel Martinez HoSang back to UW-Bothell. The last time he was here, it was 2013. He was an associate professor of ethnic studies and political science at the University of Oregon, and he was here in person. Today, he is associate professor in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration and American Studies programs at Yale University. And after much technical difficulty, is joining us virtually. Professor HoSang is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 5 books, including the multiple award-winning Racial Propositions, Ballot Initiatives, and the Making of Post-War California. And with Joe Lowndes, Producers, Parasites, and Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. With Kimberly Crenshaw, he's editor of the forthcoming volume, Under the Blacklight, The Intersectional Vulnerabilities That COVID Lays Bare, which will be published by Haymarket Books. In addition to his published scholarship, Dr. HoSang supports a summer community organizing training program for undergraduate students in conjunction with Alliance for a Just Society, and a research and advocacy project on public reconstruction and organizing campaigns for public goods. He joins us today to talk about his latest book, A Wider Type of Freedom, How Struggles for Racial Justice Liberate Everyone, recently published by the University of California Press. This powerful book provides a genealogy of how, as he writes, quote, movements to confront and abolish particular forms of racial domination have yielded universal articulations of freedom. So please join me in welcoming Dr. HoSang.
Everyone, thank you so much, Professor Berger. I just want to first, express gratitude for hosting me and like what deep admiration I have for the work at UW-Bothell, the fantastic faculty, the extraordinary students I got to meet the last time I was there. It's such an important site of ethnic studies, knowledge production, research, socially committed scholarship. So I'm really grateful to be in your presence. And I think, Professor Berger, if I talk for about 20, 25 minutes, does that work? Okay. And then really welcome your questions to just give you a little bit of an overview of the book and then talk in particular about the kind of chapter on labor. So I'll share my screen and look forward to get going. I'll just say, like very quickly, my own background is in community and labor organizing. I was an organizer for 10 years before I went back to graduate school. And part of the interest in writing this book was thinking about a kind of like usable history of anti-racist organizing that might be linked to the many, many struggles happening like across our campuses, across society today. So that's broadly the ambition of this. And today when kind of anti-racism, especially in the last year and a half, has emerged, it's kind of reemerged as the story of white humiliation. So any ambitions, realizations of racial justice in this kind of like marketplace interest group politics necessarily mean the humiliation and diminution and degradation of those who think of themselves as white. And this is on the one hand, a very old story about linking especially Black freedom movements to white humiliation. But it's absolutely come to frame many of these contestations more recently. But another story that I think is kind of like right alongside it is, particularly since 2020 and the kind of like uprisings against anti-Black police violence and a whole set of social forces, is the ways that many elite institutions have sought to incorporate the kind of broad energy around anti-racism into their missions, work, etc. So this is a Goldman Sachs ad, and literally now, like every big bank on Wall Street, every elite university, every Fortune 500 company has some iteration, some formation of the ways that to kind of both, on the one hand, legitimate the inevitable presence of racial disparities and racial inequality, but to kind of suggest or position that the corporate marketplace, existing state institutions are best positioned to ameliorate, to address this. We can see this really, and this was an ad run by Uber. I think last summer. It happened the same time as they were fighting a California ballot measure that would have recognized Uber and other kind of gig employees as given them like a broad range of labor rights, but the argument that if you personally abide and have like racist ideas, then Uber doesn't want to serve you. So this whole sense of like the marketplace as the site of, I think what's important about this is we often think about racism through the politics of exclusion, right? Exclusion from the economy, as customers, as students, as residents, but we also don't think about the ways that part of how racism continues to reproduce itself is a certain kind of selective incorporation and inclusion within these dominant institutions. And there's a longer history about that. And I don't want to just say this as, it is on the one hand like a deeply cynical move, of course, for Wall Street to be kind of situating itself as the site of like anti-racist possibility, but it's also a recurrent reminder that that's precisely how these institutions are able to kind of reproduce and legitimate themselves, is by absorbing and incorporating different kinds of energies. So many of the stories I explore in the book, and in particular in this chapter on labor, come from anti-racist efforts that are kind of very cognizant of that kind of dilemma, which is how do you bring grievances and address and transform an institution that simultaneously, or sets of power relations, want to exclude you, but also selectively incorporate you, and kind of what we can learn from these past efforts. So I just wanted, so what I'm going to do in kind of 3 short parts is just say a little bit of something from the beginning of the book about like just an example of how we might think about how incorporation works in this context. And then I'll share a few examples from the labor chapter in particular, and then look forward to questions. So this is a really iconic photo taken in 1963. It's kind of, colloquially known as George Wallace's stand at the schoolhouse door. So this is Governor George Wallace in Alabama, at the University of Alabama. When he's elected in 1960, he declares famously, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And in this photo, the Deputy Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, is there with a court order and the US Marshals to order Wallace to desegregate and to admit 2 Black students, including a young woman named Vivian Malone. Now, Malone had already moved in actually to the university by the time this was framed. And so Wallace in part needed to kind of pose for a certain picture that would seem to communicate to his supporters that he was defiantly staring down the federal government's efforts to integrate. But also this is, Kennedy's Deputy Attorney General also needed this photo because they wanted to, and were, quite interested in staging what kind of freedom meant and what anti-racist freedom meant in this context, which was the entrance of Black students into this university where they would be nominally free. So we can note here that Malone herself is, of course, not in the photo. It's about the liberal state kind of staring down the kind of figure of exclusion, ignorance, and racism so that racial justice might triumph. Later that night, Kennedy delivers a really famous, and this is Malone going in eventually to the university, civil rights speech, one that's actually cheered by Dr. King and many civil rights leaders. And Kennedy says, we have to move into the future. We can no longer tolerate these forms of blatant segregation, and we will welcome, people in. But he says very clearly, like, once you're in the institution, now it's kind of on you. We welcome you in to enjoy the freedoms of serving in the military, of being a consumer in our great market society and enjoying the benefits of it. But you're free then to rise and fall. He's very, very clear about that. You don't lose your culpability in that process. There's nothing guaranteed. And so I think it's important here because, you know, Malone was part herself of a civil rights family that had a long history of collective organizing. So other ways we might have imagined freedom at this moment, a collective claim on resources, a reimagination of the university and what it's for, a redistribution of resources, reparations, et cetera, those are all excluded. The only version of freedom we get is an individuated one in which Malone individually goes in and is alleged to get the kind of benefits of the institution. Malone has a very difficult time over the next 4 years, faces different forms of harassment, actually has difficulty getting a job into her chosen field. But, you know, what's important, you know, Dr. King in 1963 was actually really cheered that Kennedy would make the speech. But only a few years later, and this story comes from the great Harry Belafonte, the activist, organizer, entertainer, who said that, you know, a few years later, Dr. King confides in him, and the quote's rendered a couple different ways, but I've come to believe that we're integrating into a burning house. And this is a kind of startling quote to think about, right? It's still at the high point of civil rights legislative victories. The Fair Housing Act is going to be passed in the next year. This was very much the King's vision of what integration might mean, is passing this landmark legislation so that people might have access to these resources. And as we'll see in a moment, he's increasingly concerned that the underlying relations in the nation, as it pertains to the economy, militarism, the kind of like deep-seated forms of racism that he understands are not going away because of this legislation, continue to worry him. And he says, I think quite prophetically, you know, we can watch the house burn down, we can go inside and ourselves get consumed by the flames, or we can try to work somehow on rebuilding and restructuring the house, not just for the, you know, many millions of Black people that have been kept out, but actually because the house itself is burning. You know, the house itself needs to be restructured. And I thought about, you know, King's quote in relationship to how we might understand the presence of freedom in Alabama today. And we could say this about any state, say Connecticut, where I'm in, we could say it about Washington. Alabama has, I want to say, 6 military bases. So the huge presence all across, you know, deep investment in public resources, in munitions, arms, soldiers, training. That's in Alabama. An enormous carceral system. I want to say perhaps the 4th or 5th highest per capita incarceration rate, extraordinarily high for African Americans, but also even the white incarceration rate in Alabama, if you compared it to other countries, would be among the highest in the world. The proliferation of low-wage, non-union labor. Alabama actually did have an important organized labor presence, especially in the steel mills, but over the last 40 years has really withered. And like, you know, following the contours of the rest of the country, we see deep forms of income, wealth, resources. Deaths, what we call deaths of despair, from drug overdose, especially in a state that's flooded with opioid prescriptions, such that even white Alabamans struggle to find meaning and possibility, particularly as they age into middle age. And, you know, while all of Alabama, of course, is once indigenous land and home to like a broad range of tribal nations, one federally recognized tribe exists in Alabama, just to the south. So I want to, you know, just say this about how we think about freedom, because some people might say, well, look, the reason we have such desperate and unequal conditions, you know, that's a legacy of Wallace, right? That's the legacy of kind of Southern white supremacy, segregation day, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. But remember, you know, Wallace loses. And indeed, Wallace actually later apologizes to Vivian Malone and attempts to reconcile and says, I was wrong. You absolutely deserve access. This Alabama is Kennedy's Alabama, as much as it is Wallace's, right? This is the Alabama of freedom of access to markets, to rising and falling, to access to a kind of unbridled militarism. So this is the kind of dilemma, which is that what happens when freedom is individuated, only talked about in rights in this way, that kind of produces this larger form of precarity. And what do we do in response? What are the collective organizing strategies that don't simply demand inclusion into the burning house, or to try to shift the terms of subordination onto someone else, but in ways that act to kind of put the fire out for everyone? And this is King later on, and I just want to give us a couple of, this very important essays that he's writing in the year before he's assassinated. Among these, this formulation, racism is a philosophy based on a contempt for life. And just note here, he's not just talking about a contempt for Black life as if it has the capacity to protect other forms of life. He's talking about it as a broadly diminished social vision, that it doesn't actually have the capacity to value life. And so if we're thinking, if this is how King is defining racism for us, what is the vision of anti-racism? What is the negation of a philosophy based on a contempt for life? How do we articulate that? And so the book is divided into just, 4 pretty brief chapters. One that looks at the body as a site of both domination and resistance. One that looks at internationalism and efforts to link up and build social solidarity across national borders. One on governance and democracy and kind of how we collectively shape and the conditions of our lives. And then that I'll be talking about today about labor. And for the labor one, I just want to say, as a way to kind of get into it, and again, to return to King, this is again from, what he's arguing very, very late in his life. We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. So he's clear there that it's not about ameliorating, a couple of sites that are somehow exceptional, right? The whole thing has to be restructured. But he links this to actual histories of anti-Black racism and enslavement by saying, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And so what's important about this is he's linking the kind of transatlantic trade and the economy and social relations that grew out of it with contemporary post-emancipation, post-abolition relationships, the ways that the social formation turns people into things, which is a central part, of course, of relations of slavery, but it doesn't end after that, nor, and while its violence is absolutely powerfully exercised on Black people, it doesn't limit its violence to Black people alone. And King says this continuously, this process of thingification, turning a person into a thing. And then says, therefore, they will exploit them, and poor people generally economically, in a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else. It will have to use its military to protect them. And all of these problems are tied together. So, we see here in King, like some sense of understanding the totality of the social relations and how specific efforts, whether he's supporting the striking sanitation workers in Memphis or trying to figure out access to housing in Chicago, that those are linked to broader transformations. And this leads then to the, I just want to share some examples in this kind of second part from the chapter on labor, in which I'm trying to kind of lift up, within this framework, efforts that are indeed very local. They're very, very much focused on specific wages and working conditions and union recognition in a place, but yet they're pitched at reimagining the totality, as King says more broadly. And I opened the chapter with this march in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1991 that the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, which is a really important Midwest-based farm worker organization that was organizing farm workers in the Southeast at a pickle farm, cucumber farm. But they do this rally on Juneteenth, because part of what they're narrating is not the kind of like more familiar narrative of like an immigrant worker who comes to the country to find freedom, but actually says, if we're to understand the conditions in the pickle fields for mostly Mexican migrant workers, we have to understand the larger landscape of legacies of slavery, of the kind of plantation economy, and how it reproduced itself all across the South, even after abolition. So they're very consciously choosing not to reject that sense of, I'll work hard, I'll labor, and the American dream will be mine, and more taking political and historical direction from Black workers who said, that's been mythologized. There is no simple kind of like working your way up the ladder. We have to attend to the broad underpinnings of the structure. And so I think it's what I want to try to pick up here is their sense that if we're to get a fair contract for work in the North Carolina fields, we have to attend to these other relationships. So they're marching here with housekeepers and university employees from the state university, other Black workers organizing in other places, not just as a symbol of kind of like being an ally. They understand there is no kind of freedom in the cucumber fields without also addressing these other kinds of relationships. That insight is clear to them. I then move in the chapter to talk about, the legendary James Boggs and later Grace Lee Boggs, whose, work has been documented by many other scholars. I'll just say quickly about this. Boggs is himself born in Alabama, kind of comes north to Detroit during the Great Migration, has a long career as an auto worker. And he's very clear as he begins writing, especially he's involved in different Marxist formations. He has really important exchanges with C.L.R. James, who I'll mention in a moment. But he can kind of see, even in the kind of belly of the beast of these enormous sprawling auto plants, more than 50 years ago, what we understand very clearly today, which is there's actually not enough work for everyone to do. The machines are speeding up faster and faster. It's creating splits between the reduced number of people who have access to jobs so that they have an income to support themselves, and a whole set of other people who are rendered without work. And saying the whole thing we're doing to constantly produce is having these devastating effects on the planet. It promotes militarism, et cetera. And so he says in this moment, he's appreciating what the machines are doing. They're always talking about the machines. Now that our productive machinery has been developed to the point that it can do the tasks that have been heretofore been done by men, everyone, regardless of class, regardless of background, is entitled to the enjoyment of the fruits of that development, just as all men are entitled to warm themselves in the heat of the sun. So he has a sense up and against even the most kind of militant labor formations that were still always concerned about like full employment. Like, how do we make sure that our members are fully employed? How do we try to push back marginally around working conditions or pensions or others? Boggs is he's a union person, so he takes those things seriously, but part of what he can see is just getting a better contract is actually not dealing with the kind of broader transformation of social forces. And he kind of argues, and I'll say also this is connected to the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that he's has some connection to, but are really organizing on their own afterwards, who also realize like freedom is not even, again, they're union members and they understand the importance of the union, but they also have a sense like we can have a great contract. We are still facing with all of the brutalities of policing in Detroit, that lead to a rebellion. We deal with segregation in schools. We deal with all other these kind of like sites of inequality. So just hiving off a contract alone to protect us is not going to do it, and instead argues like we have to use our place within the point of production to remake social relations everywhere. So again, there's like a consciousness about not simply offering a kind of nominal form of incorporation through a good contract that's going to leave many other people out, and thinking, what does it mean to build connections and alliances with students, with people who are wageless, who don't have access to jobs? What kind of social formation might come out of that? Two more examples just to share quickly and then to look forward to your questions. Then turn to Los Angeles. In the late 90s, there was a really important organizing effort among Latino and Korean workers in a large Korean American-owned supermarket, Asi supermarket. So Koreatown in kind of central Los Angeles has the largest population of Koreans outside of Seoul, hundreds of thousands of people. And in the late 90s, there was a group of kind of produce workers, all Latino, Mexican, and Central American, who were laboring. Their hours were cut. They were humiliated. They talked about being turned into a thing, who walked off the job. They were tired of it. But where they went to was the offices of a group called Kiwa, the Korean Immigrant Worker Advocates, who kind of were leftist Korean Americans. They themselves were shaped by the Korean student democratic movement in the late 80s. They formed this organization just before the LA rebellion in the early 90s. And they really saw that, Latino workers were constantly put into competition both with one another and with Korean workers from whom they were alienated. So they embarked on a process, a multi-year process, to try to build a multilingual union that integrated Korean workers, Latino workers, and really tried to overcome a core, kind of challenge and contradiction of capitalist labor relations, which is the kind of alienation of workers from one another, making their lives inaccessible to one another, and forcing them to race against one another. And while the effort isn't successful, you can see them. I mean, they ultimately get some a settlement that brings some money. Part of what you can see them doing is addressing and trying to rebuild those social relations, those forms of solidarity that might allow them to contend with the power that this employer had over them. And finally, Dorothy Bolden, who's a really important organizer in Atlanta in the 60s and 70s. She had long worked since the 30s and 40s as a domestic worker. So many Black women in the wake of emancipation, go into domestic jobs working in white households. And Bolden famously, in creating the National Domestic Workers Union, and there's great scholarship on this, understands these workers are not in a single shop floor. They work across 10,000 employment sites in the greater Atlanta area. And she actually understands that the place to organize them is the bus. The bus is where they go to and from their job sites. But really, in the organizing that they do, have to take inventory and action against these long-standing relations of they're often between white women who are running the households and Black women who are working there. And so Bolden and the union are training workers about how to demonstrate their power and skill and authority to the women that employ them. And in doing so, are not just, they're both getting better wages and working conditions for these workers, but they're actually trying to take on a much more deep-seated sense of kind of gendered race relations across the South. And this is building on a long history of Black women organizing, doing the same work. So all of these, I want to just argue, they're specific, and they're absolutely trying to attend to very material conditions, but they're understanding and seeing larger structures that have kind of wider benefits. And so just as the last slide, the book takes its kind of title from C.L.R. James, who in 1939 publishes this magnificent History of Pan-African Revolt, where he's looking at Black revolt in Alabama and in the Caribbean and South Africa. And the book ends with this line: "The African bruises and breaks himself against his bars in the interest of freedom wider than his own." And he's kind of really trying to tell, especially people on the left, people in labor, that these struggles that you think of as provisional and not really central to the kind of consciousness of the working class, this is where all the social relations are being challenged and contested, and this is where the new futures might lie. So I'll leave it at that. I'm really grateful for the chance to share just a little bit of it, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you, everyone.
I don't know if you can hear the applause, but great. So I have several questions coming in, and we'll invite those who are here in person who haven't yet put anything on a sticky note to bring it up as you have it. But I want to start with two kind of linked questions. Do you believe that capitalism and free market politics can coexist with anti-racism in any meaningful way? And relatedly, do you think that integrating into existing social structures is productive?
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I'll just say about the first one that I think is interesting, and I tried to make this argument earlier, is I think we have to actually think about anti-racism as having many different politics connected to it. So there is a Goldman Sachs anti-racism there's a capitalist version which says that, you know, your race, gender, your ascribed identities should not keep you from being able to compete in a market-based economy. That is, in some sense, anti-racist. I mean, it's arguing that market competition will provide the basis, the resources, the possibilities to overcome, abolish, you know, contend with existing racial hierarchies. So I don't even think of that as like just a kind of cover or, you know, like an obfuscation. That's their account. This is, you can bring people into the market, allow them to compete, give them the skills they need. And that account is everywhere. I mean, you see it all across consumer culture, right? Like, we want you in. We want you we want you to be represented. We want you as a worker. We want you as a manager, as a leader. So for me, it's not just like, that is one among many anti-racist politics. And I think, but part of what I want to lift up from King is arguing like, we can be incorporated into a system in which disposability is inevitable. Some people are going to have to get disposed. And if racism is based on contempt, right, that there are people who are disposable, we're not simply trying to just diversify those who are disposable. We're trying to reimagine everything. And that was King's sense of what I think it meant, what anti-racism meant. If race gave people the vocabulary to think about disposability, then anti-racism had to give us a vocabulary in which we would regard nobody as disposable. To the second great question, it's not an all or nothing proposition. You know, Boggs, Drum, Bolden, they all, you know, there's an uneven form of labor recognition we have in this country, but none of them refused it. By all means, let's organize into unions, let's get contracts. But I think unlike many white workers, especially white men, who said, well, that's freedom, right? I get the contract, have a good job. I mean, I still have to race the machines. Their sense was like, well, that's not freedom. One, because, you know, we are very clear not all of us can be in that. And second, we're still racing against these hellacious machines. So I think it's not a question of just refusing incorporation or accepting it, but like, to what end are we trying to use these institutions and formations, and what work do we want them to do for us? If that makes sense.
That's excellent. I think I have several questions that follow on that. So one is a specific question to the historical time period of the 60s. You talked about Drum and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in the chapter. Students in my class also watched Finally Got the News as part of the reading for this week. And so how do you see, you know, Drum saw UAW as another arm of management, right? As one of the barriers to overcome. So how do you see the unions and worker formations that you are talking about and thinking about here avoid incorporation into the companies that their members work for, or kind of speak beyond the limitations of that, of a certain model of organized labor that you were just speaking about in terms of a certain kind of white male worker framework?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I mean, I think like part of what their critique was of the UAW was, look, their interests are now essentially interchangeable with those of the auto companies. They both want the same things. They want to keep the factories running as much as possible so that they can keep jobs for the, you know, existing membership. And they're really, the differences are over kind of how to divide the surplus that comes from that work. So, you know, I want to say that's different than them saying, which they could also say, that the union leadership was racist and like not including people, because there were Black workers that thought about that route, that said, well, what we should do is challenge the existing union leadership so that we can like diversify it. But I think Drum's contention was, that's not the only problem. It's not just who is there. It's that politically, there's no, they're as invested in this kind of race to just keep the machines going, as the employers are. So they needed a different kind of formation to be able to contest that. The other things that, I think they did like famously is thought about, the record in unions is just not, there's more community unionism now than there has been in the recent past. But it's often where unions are kind of seeking support of community-based organizations when faced, with a contract campaign, et cetera. And those are important relationships to develop. But I think Drum was doing something much different, which is that you can't really so neatly separate out people's experience in the workplace from what's happening them to other places. If you're getting harassed by the cops going into work, if you're having, like living in segregated and like dilapidated housing, those are labor issues too. And you can see that in Kiwa. I think you can see that in the domestic workers union. They have a much more expansive sense. They're not so clearly like separating out, right? That like the contract is the site through which you address your workplace grievances. And then, you may join a civic organization outside. They have a much more integrated understanding of the relationship between social control and domination outside the workplace and domination inside the workplace.
So let me also not only encourage those in person to keep questions coming, but also those online. If folks have questions you want to put it in the chat, that's great as well. Let me connect this to the present a little bit. For the last couple of years, we've been hearing about the so-called Great Resignation, but we're also seeing the remarkably successful unionization campaigns of major corporations like Starbucks and Amazon, who were thought to be too big to organize. And so what sort of connections do you see between the workers' movements you're talking about and today? And also, what kinds of challenges or opportunities do you see for contesting differentiation and exploitation in this kind of contemporary move, this contemporary wave of unionization?
Yeah, thanks. This is a question for all of us to like discuss and deliberate perhaps. But I was like struck both the kind of from the pandemic shutdown to the kind of, the refusal or deep ambivalence about work, that like work is freedom. Those are all things that Boggs is saying 70 years ago, right? Clear, like this is not, racing against these machines is not freedom. It's going to end badly for everyone. And there was also this moment during the pandemic when, like some workers are subject to these like deeply dangerous and exploitative conditions, and other workers are sheltered at home, right? And Boggs warns about the kind of social crisis that can happen under that, where different groups of workers come to despise and get angry at one another because these forms of competition are built in. So I'm just again struck. It's like if you ask almost any mainstream labor leader in the 60s, like what's the strategy here? The strategy is go get a job, work, and get a good contract, and we're good. And Boggs is saying that's not going to end up well for anyone. Like eventually these machines are going to go faster and faster, and we're going to be left out. So and that's part. I just want to say that to get back to the kind of like underlying argument of the book. There's a kind of a really universal assertion and principle at work in what we might otherwise think of as like rights organizing. Right? It is rights organizing, but it also exceeds that. And for me, the Amazon and Starbucks example, one, I think are like the fact that so many people feel invested in the outcome of the Amazon election is not just, it is because we want Amazon workers to have like more decent working conditions and pay, but also some hope that if they can stop the Amazonification of their lives, right, that other workers who are operating under the same sense, like how do I keep up with this algorithm, that's actually pervading so many, even white collar occupations. You can see it in education as well. Like there is some hope, right? Can they do something to arrest the authority that the algorithm, which means then us competing against one another and against the machines. So I think for me, it does speak to this, like a wider type of freedom, why we would be invested in their outcome. And clearly they've at least, the Staten Island organizers, some of the others have taken some, creativity and have been about, beyond traditional organizing, thinking about where you meet up and connect to workers, how workers connect to one another, how you prevent employers from treating workers, unions as third parties. All of that, all of those innovations, I think, are really important.
Can you say a little bit more about something you just said about rights organizing that exceeds a rights framework? Can you say more about what you mean?
Yeah, so like on the one hand, you might, if we might read about Boggs or Drum or even Amazon, we could see like, well, all right, they're acting in their self-interest. They want a better, benefit deal. They have grievances. And sure, if they win, like, I'm with them. And, this term we often have of like ally, like, sure, I'll support that. Versus when, Drum is contesting what's happening in the auto plant, or when Amazon workers are trying to figure out what their relationship is to the machines, there's something much broader at stake there. It's not just about it is about the conditions. I don't want to erase or not take seriously the very specific things that are leading, workers into this, but that there's larger questions and structures that are at stake. And Boggs was always trying to make that point. It's not just, there's no way we can just get a slightly better deal for ourselves while the kind of larger relations of power are undisturbed, as the UAW, frankly, was trying to do for itself.
And so within that kind of posture, how do you see social movements being able to challenge institutional structures without becoming sort of engulfed or co-opted or incorporated in the way that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly no like magic formula. One thing I want to say also is that the three examples I shared here, none of them actually like won in the long term. So part of what I'm like trying to argue is like, but I think it's also why Amazon in particular is exciting, and some of these others, is that they're trying out provisionally these forms of formation and organization that like might have the possibility of disturbing something, of poking something out. I mean, even the way, Amazon workers, especially in Staten Island, like so clearly connected that organizing campaign to pandemic health conditions, to the racialized disparities that are produced there, that animated all of the work. Does that make sense? So they're clearly trying to bring in those kind of social relations. But this is not about we'll often have these discussions today. You'll see postings about like, we have to reimagine, we have to, think in these utopic forms. That's true. But part of what I'm struck by here is, what are the steps? What are the tools? What are the moves we make to take us from where we are now towards something that feels more liberatory? And that involves contesting and disturbing and reimagining very specific kinds of social relations. It's not like you just draw up the utopian society and then, wish really hard, right? And so that's partly what, like the whole, just to go back to the Kiwa example in Los Angeles. I mean, all these relations that make Latino workers there so vulnerable to exploitation. They're not protected by state employment laws because of citizenship, their citizen status. They're alienated from Korean American workers through language, and the labor law themselves is not going to help them. So those are the material conditions that are keeping people there, and they're engaging in organizing strategies to try to figure out how to contest those very specific conditions.
So what does that tell us about, or maybe not tell us, but we live in a time, as you were saying at the beginning, where it's like diversity, equity, and inclusion, those kinds of initiatives are widespread. And some of them are cynical, but some of them are quite sincere, and yet their sincerity is within this limited framework that you're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
This is an aside, but I always love thinking about during 2020 when gushers tweeted out, "We wouldn't be gushers without the Black community, and we're working with our friends at Fruit by the Foot to make a difference," or whatever.
Yeah.
Just these sort of comical sorts of engagements, and yet there is this kind of sincerity there. And so what I'm curious your thoughts on this kind of, you talk about this book as a usable history of anti-racist organizing, and what does that history tell us about engaging with or thinking through this proliferation of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a kind of framework for kind of status quo institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I want to thank you for that great question and just maybe offer like two things in response. One is, I do think having a critical orientation towards, I mean, I think George Lipsitz calls it these efforts to diversify the ranks of the pain inflictors, right? That there will always be efforts to try to pluralize, and I think actually elite institutions that are so culpable in the kind of misfortune of so others, it's not surprising that Goldman Sachs is among the first to say, we want to support a Black entrepreneurship fund. Because there's a way that a kind of anti-racist multicultural politics serves to indemnify many of these powerful institutions from larger critiques. And I think that's the proposition, they understand it. And I think a critical orientation towards that is absolutely necessary. It's why the language of diversity and inclusion, in some cases may be necessary, but it's certainly far from sufficient. And when that becomes normalized, that's what racial justice means. It simply means representation or incorporation without examining the underlying structures. Then I think we've really limited and moved quite afar from what King said, which is like, you got to change everything. So I've, seen in many organizing campaigns these days where when workers, tenants, residents are framing their demands around race, the dominant institutions will often try to deflect those by saying, well, look who we have at the table here negotiating, or look how we're trying to incorporate. So I think we just need like consciousness and fluency around that to be able to distinguish those. But the second thing I want to say quickly is, incorporation is simply the name of how we relate to, these market systems. So think about during the pandemic, we said another world is possible. We can reimagine all of this, but many people were then forced to hit order on their Amazon button, right? Or to get deliveries, right? We can have huge critiques of big banks, but when we need cash, almost all of us have to go to the ATM to get it, because that's the nature of it. It denies other possibilities and therefore requires you to be incorporated. I use an example in the book, the California Teachers Union, which is a huge and really important union protecting the public good in California. Their pension, which all, they need, just like, Professor Berger, you and I need our retirement funds, all of that is invested through Wall Street. So their well-being is materially tied to how Wall Street does, and in terms of extracting value from others. So that's part of the kind of knot, which is like, my rise requiring someone else's deprivation. And I think that's part of what King is trying to get us. So I guess I wanted just to say that to say, it's not a matter of like being unethical or selling out when you get incorporated. All of us constantly get incorporated into these formations.
So given that, do you believe that there is freedom in America? Is there truly freedom in this country if we have to fight for our rights constantly?
Yeah, well, that's another question for all of us to debate. I mean, what I will take that question to say is like, there's clearly many articulations of freedom, right? There's market freedom, there's individuated freedom, there's not just one shared sense. And I think part of fighting for a certain kind of collective vision of freedom is being able to define what that means. And certainly it has to mean not just freedom from, right? Freedom from discrimination, a kind of negative, right, imposition of the state, like I as an individual should do, but like, what are the collective sets of relationships and resources and possibilities that we kind of all need to be free? And that's often just not part of the discussion or debate about what it means when someone is saying, I'm demanding freedom. In that sense.
Can you say a little bit more about kind of your process in approaching the book and this idea of usable history? Maybe even thinking about why write this book, like why did you think there was a need to illuminate how struggles for racial justice liberate everyone? And I know this project started before the pandemic. You talked about some of the ways that the pandemic exacerbated some of these pressure points, right? But a lot of these dynamics well perceived the last few years. So could you just say a little bit more about that, particularly thinking through labor, where so many commentators either equivocate or juxtapose race and class as these polarized subjects?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I was like to those examples of like the banks and the military and all of these powerful institutions kind of becoming more fluent, becoming more multicultural, even arguably like even mobilizing a certain kind of ethnic studies language, like a populist language, is there was a real danger that anti-racist politics were continually becoming narrowed and really much as likely to be wielded by even, forces on the right. I mean, it's part of what I wrote about, with Joe Lowndes in another book, that it wasn't just a struggle of like racism versus anti-racism, as that photo in Wallace might, get us to think about, but like, what work do we want anti-racist politics to do? What does it actually mean to be anti-racist, right? Beyond just like how to be an anti-racist, like it's some quality of your interior. We can think about that in other terms, right? There's queer politics, LGBTQ politics. They're absolutely about getting, recognition from corporations, being recognized as a consumer market. We can think about how like pride marches themselves have changed so much and kind of lost some of their politics. We can think about the distinction between like a Sheryl Sandberg feminism that's about kind of like the professional incorporation versus a kind of wider feminism that wants to reimagine gender as a category of social life. So I think we need to do the same thing for race. There's anti-racist politics that Citibank has, and there's another kind of anti-racist politics that's actually not about that. It's not just about pluralizing. I had some sense that this history of anti-racism was less visible, in part because language about equity and inclusion was becoming so commonplace. It had come to be the default. When I say racial justice, I simply mean equity and inclusion. And so I wanted to kind of help make visible this long and wide and deep history where that was never the ambition. It wasn't, well, race is just a distraction. Let's get to the more fundamental, economic issues on the one hand, but it also wasn't about incorporation. And so that's partly why I thought these stories were important to tell, because more and more people, who consider themselves on the left were, perhaps fairly noting, look at what passes for anti-racist politics. It's Citibank politics. Let's just denounce that, right? Like it's just a trick. Let's get down to more fundamental things. And that these movements also, certainly refuse those easy kinds of like binaries.
Well, one of your examples was about Uber, saying, if you tolerate racism, delete Uber. And you noted that they were at the same time fighting a ballot initiative to not consider Uber drivers workers. And so wondering if you talk a little bit about the sort of rise of independent contractors and whether this is an effort by companies to prevent unionization, and whether that kind of precarious labor augurs new possibilities of whether unionization or other forms of anti-racist organizing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, maybe that is the organizing question in front of us. I mean, here's the thing that I think is interesting and tricky about that is, on the one hand, because so many prevailing, we can think about the taxi industry in cities like New York, was rife with forms of racial discrimination, both affecting customers and drivers. It was built on racialized logics. So that when these new kind of labor relations emerge, they actually do hold open some possibility, right? It's like the access to mobility, right? Promised through ride sharing systems. I don't think that's not just a slogan. That has material effects in terms of giving people access on the one hand. And it is also clearly a way to try to bring more labor into an arrangement where they have fewer rights and more control can be exercised over them. So this is again why simply just like representation and incorporation alone aren't sufficient analytics if we're really to understand like how these companies work. But that was like very tricky in California around this initiative. There were like plenty of folks of color who were like, Uber is what gives me, economic independence, either as a driver or rider. There were civil rights groups, coming out for it. So, it does make what constitutes an anti-racist politics, something that's just not self-evident, something, and the last thing I'll say quickly is, all of these groups, Drum, Boggs, they're so committed to like political education to try to figure out all of these complexities because they're not self-evident. And there's a way in which, as inspired as I am by the kind of like new fluency people have around race and racial justice, it also has a tendency to be kind of like condensed into sound bites. It's like, so why Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, on the one hand is this like opening, but on the other hand, can foreclose, I think, some of the deeper analytic work that's evident in many of these groups.
That brings up a good point, and then I will do one last call for questions after this. But to what extent do you think that kind of questions of study and education are a part of this, right? So that things are not flattened out, as you said, that they don't end up in that kind of reductive soundbite-ification. But how do you see, obviously we're having this conversation in the context of the classroom, but the organizations that you're writing about, Drum, Boggs, others, are having like 8-hour-long book club readings after a full day at the factory.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the purpose or the role of study, whether classroom study or not, in engaging that kind of shifting context, or that, getting beyond the sort of superficial forms of incorporation and so on?
Yeah, I think that, this, points to your work, Professor Berger, about like prison also as a site of like consciousness and collectivity and the need to kind of like share analysis. So I do think, among some like unions that I've like had a chance to work with, I'll like often talk about that. Like you can be covered by a contract, you can even be active in your union, but that doesn't necessarily, like shift your consciousness around many kinds of issues, right? So, and you can see that, like there's amazing public sector worker locals, Oregon, Washington, and many places that do really important work, protecting against privatization, protecting public services, but whose members are also all over the board politically. And the challenge is, because it's like, well, we got to get ready for our next contract campaign, right? We have just educating people about getting involved, getting stewards involved, others. It almost seems like, beyond sending people a newsletter or, having them read a social media account, like how can we do this work? But I think there is a lesson from these that we have to figure that out, how it is that we can use existing unions, which still have millions of members, to do that kind of like political education. And just, two sites to point to that, many others are raised, and I talk about a little bit in the book, teacher organizing in Chicago and Los Angeles, nurses organizing, those two teachers unions, which are doing amazing work now. 15 years ago, they looked more like traditional unions that were kind of, service. The union is like something that helps you out when you're in trouble. You give them the dues, it's a transaction. And a set of leaders there said, if we're going to transform this, we also have to transform ourselves, our own consciousness about who we're connected to, who we move together with. And that was a long-term process. But when you saw these amazing strikes that teachers pulled off, you saw the kind of benefits of that. And I would say the same thing among like, healthcare worker unions, that it's not just about, it is very much about their wages and working conditions, but it's also tied to the corporate organization and control of healthcare and, wanting to transform that. So I think there's real payoff for it, but I think we're at the early stages of actually what it would mean to bring that to scale.
Let me invite a last round of questions, both from those of you here in person and also those of you online, if you want to put any questions in the chat. while you are maybe thinking of any questions, I will also just remind people about the upcoming events that we have in the Liberate Colloquium, which are in the chat, and you can access the website there for information about them or to register. And I think, well, I'll just wait for Carson to post the last one. Thank you so much for joining us. This is just such a treat for all of us, and I'm so delighted that we can dig into your book in this way.
Yeah, I'm grateful to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
All right, maybe we can thank everyone. Yeah. Okay, going to